Hello everyone and welcome to episode 8 of my beginner's guide to Kerbal Space Program. In the last episode we designed a budget for getting a spaceship to the moon, achieving an orbit, and getting itself back to Kerbin. And with that Delta V budget in hand, we built ourselves, well, this little spacecraft that we see right here. In this episode, we're going to be building a booster that is capable of getting this craft into low Kerbin orbit so that it can achieve what it needs to do. And in the process of building that booster, we're going to talk about a few things. Number one, we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about staging, specifically how different staging configurations affect the total Delta V of the rocket. We're also going to take a look at a couple of additional tools in the VAB, the center of mass and center of thrust overlays, and how that information helps us in the designing of our rockets. And finally, we got a few new parts that I have recently unlocked in this particular game. These are all going to be parts that help us design rockets that are more stable and easier for us to fly. Now, before we go any further into this, I want to go back out into the main view here because I want to make a change to the settings. So what we're going to do is we're going to hit the pause menu and we're going to go over here to settings. I'm going to scroll down until I get to, well, I'm just looking and looking and looking, and there it is, this line right here, Advanced Tweakables. And by the way, when you start a new game, you can adjust this at the very beginning, but the default for this is that this is disabled. So I'm going to hit this little toggle so that it is enabled, because there's one thing in this video that I want to show you, and there will be some other things in future videos that I want to show you are in this category of advanced tweakables. So if you want to follow along on your own, one thing you want to do with your save is go into the settings and make sure advanced tweakables is enabled. Anyway, we're going to apply that and accept it, resume our game, and go right back into the VAB. Alright, so what we need to do is we need to get this fella into space. We knew once we get this into low Kerbin orbit, it can do what we need to do. We need to make sure that we can get it there. And remember that what we're looking for to get into low Kerbin orbit is about 3,600 meters per second of vacuum Delta V. Okay, well, let's get started. So we're going to start fairly simple. We're going to take ourselves a stack decoupler here. We're going to stick it to the bottom of our engine. We're going to go to our fuel tanks. We're going to use a liquid fuel engine for our core stage. This is my largest liquid fuel tank that I have to date, the FL-T400 fuel tank. We'll stick on a few of these. And again, one of the things you can do is you can copy parts rather than going back up to here. If I hold the Alt key and click the part, it makes a copy of it. You can do that again. So I'll stick 3 of those down there. And for our engine, I do want to have, for attitude control, a gimbaled engine. So we're going to pick, once again, the LV-T45 swivel engine. We're going to stick that down at the bottom, and then we're going to take a look at our stats here. So, first of all, do make sure, always goes back to sea level. So I'm going to make sure that is toggled onto vacuum. With that toggled on, I can see here that I have 1,976 meters per second of Delta V. That's not enough. We clearly need to add more onto this, but I also want to take a look at my thrust to weight ratio. It is 1.71. So this thing we're launching from the surface like this, that 1.71 is okay, it's decent, but this is going to end up being an upper stage booster. This engine won't turn on until we're into the upper part of the atmosphere. And this thrust to weight ratio is a little bit on the low side for the upper part of the atmosphere. You typically want that thrust to weight ratio more in kind of like the 2.05 to 2.15 range. So I can't make the thrust any higher. The thrust is at 100%. So what I'm going to do is simply remove an engine. That removes some of the mass of this thing, and then we'll take a look at this again. Of course, that reduces the Delta V, but we'll have to deal with that. 2.07, that's acceptable. I think that should be fine. So there we go. So there's our core upper stage part. Now what we need to do is put on, well, I gotta put on some aerodynamics. I'm gonna put on, and there's a reason why I'm picking this in particular, I'm gonna put this on 6-way symmetry. I've, by the way, already built and tested a version of this, so I kind of know where I'm going. So that's, you'll see why I'm going with 6-way symmetry with these fins in just a little bit. But at the same time, I don't want to just flat out build this thing. I want to show you some of the trial and error kind of process you have to go through whenever you're designing your own booster. So we're not going to proceed to our final product in, well, a straight line, and I hope people don't mind that, but I think that will be instructive in doing that. Okay, so what we want to do now is to put some more stuff on here. I don't really have a more powerful liquid fuel engine than this one, so the next parts are going to have to be radial. I'm going to go with a pair of our old friend, the BACC Thumper SRBs. Alright, so let's pull out this one. This one now, what we want is the sum of these two, right? Like this one's 1,478 meters per second, this one's 1,319 meters per second. It's adding up all the delta V's of all the stages, but it's including this stage here, and that's our orbiter, right? That has nothing to do with us getting into space. That's not part of our 3,600 meters per second we're shooting for. This total didn't include that. A simple trick that you can use is to click on where that engine is. You can see the part gets highlighted. There's where that engine is, and simply turn this thrust right down to 0. Of course, you got to remember to turn that thrust back on again when you get ready to fly this thing, but the delta V on this part has gone down to 0, so the delta V's are these two, so this total down here on the bottom is just the two lifting stages that we have, and it's a total of 2,797 meters per second. Not enough, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this decoupler like that. I'm going to go to 4-way symmetry. I'm pressing the X key for a little bit of a shortcut. I can cycle through the symmetries with the X key like that. It's a useful little shortcut instead of always clicking on there. And then I'm going to go over to here. Again, I want to go 4-way symmetry. If you hold the Shift key and press X, it goes backwards cycling through the symmetry. So there's my 4-way symmetry. Going to put that on. And that is now, let's see, 1,861 for a total of 3,339. Getting close. Not enough boosters. We need more boosters, so we're going now to 6-way symmetry. Remember my 6 tail fins. This is the reason why I went for 6 tail fins down here, so that the tail fins, if hopefully I place these right, is kind of in between all of these boosters. I knew I was going to end up with 6-way symmetry on these boosters, and there we go. And now I have a total of 3,645 meters per second. Don't forget, we also want to put some aerodynamic nose cones on there. There we go. And brought delta V down a little bit, 3,632. This should do it. But I don't know about you. I'm kind of like, I like to make my rockets as efficient as I can be. I like to take up as little mass as I can and bring my costs down as much as I can. It's a bit pedantic, but well, I'm a pedantic type of guy. So I'm going to show you how we can improve upon this number, this 3,632 meters per second. I'm going to show you that advanced tweakable I was talking about earlier. I'm going to right click on one of the boosters, and down here now is a new button, thanks to that toggle that we enabled, called Remove Symmetry. So what this does is if I click that, and notice on the staging diagram, suddenly this engine is on its own, while the other 5 are all together. So this engine now is not part of the 6-way symmetry that the other engines all are in. And I'm going to go through and I'm going to remove the symmetry on all of these. So all of these boosters are now all their own thing. Okay, we're going to go all the way around, removing all of that. Oh, I must have gone all the way around. Looks like it. Okay, so all of these now are their separate stages down here on the side, or they're all separate icons. And I'm going to do the same thing with the decouplers. Now, it's a little bit of a pain because the decouplers are kind of tucked in the middle of all of that. I could kind of hunt them down and click on them that way, but you can also click on stuff from here. If I click on that, right click, in the staging diagram, notice how that menu comes up, and we can also select remove symmetry from here, and notice that one's removed, and then I can go to this one and remove that symmetry, and then I can hit the one with the little 4 on it, remove that symmetry, and keep going until all of these are their own little icon. Oop, missed the button. Remove symmetry, And there they go. They're all removed now. And it's easier to sometimes go with the staging diagram than it is to hunt all this down. Now, so far as how this thing's going to fly, I've changed absolutely nothing. This is still 3,632 meters per second. But what I can do now is I can affect these individually how they're going to stage. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the little plus button here. I'm going to start a new stage. I'm going to take one of these rocket motors, and I do want to keep track of where. I'm going to start with this one. That's the one on the top. I'm going to drag it down here to the bottom. So this guy's going to launch by itself at the very beginning. And then when we stage, let's find the right decoupler, and that one is going to decouple. So this one's going to go off, and then when I stage next, it'll decouple. We'll lose that booster, and then these 5 will go off. Now some of you might be going, wait a minute, don't we have a problem here? Yeah, we do have a problem, but first things first, notice that my delta V has gone up. It's gone up to 3,735 meters per second. So this way of using just one booster and then going to the other 5 to stage in this sort of pattern is a more efficient way. I'm getting more performance out of this rocket. Now, on to the problem. The problem is well, when I stage this booster, so this one will be gone, right? We have 5 boosters, and these boosters are asymmetric. I'm going to show you 3 buttons down here I've yet to talk about, but we're going to talk about them here. These buttons are the center of mass overlay, the center of thrust overlay, and the aerodynamic overlay. We're going to talk about each of them, but right now I want to talk about the first 2. Let's start with center of mass overlay. So I'm going to click that, and it puts this yellow and black kind of ball on there. This is the center of mass of this vehicle. What it's indicating is kind of like the balance point of this vehicle. If you can imagine this being like, I don't know, some sort of giant model, and you would like to hang the model from the ceiling, this would be an attachment point for you to put the rope or the chain or whatever it is you're thinking of hanging this from, and this thing would be balanced at that point. So we call that point the center of mass. The next button over is called the center of thrust overlay. So let's click on that one. So what that's looking at is all the active engines, and by the way, we should turn off this engine at this point. Let's turn its thrust right off. There we go. I'm going to pin that over to the side to remind me to turn it back on. So because now the only active engines are these 5 boosters here, this is indicating where the center of push of all of these is going to be, the combined thrust of all 5 of those engines. And the direction of that thrust is along this big arrow here. And the thing to notice is that although the center of mass is a little bit to the left, the center of thrust is even more to the left. This is an asymmetrical situation. If this line of thrust does not go exactly through the center of mass, this vessel is going to have a tendency to want to turn, in this case, from our perspective here, towards the right. It's going to be really tough to get this thing to fly the way you want it to fly. And that's because of the asymmetry that's happening. And then the reason is because we have more engines here towards the left side than we have on the right side of the rocket. So we don't want to have that happening. So what we're going to do is we're going to put this booster back on. What I'm going to do is hit Control Z. This is a standard Windows shortcut key, and that's a reverse key. That got me easier back to the situation I was in before. Okay, so what we did, we had this motor here. I would love to have this motor again go first, but to maintain balance, what we're going to do is we're going to pick the opposite one so that it goes at the same time. See how that works? And then what we're going to do is we're going to pick the right decouplers. That's this decoupler, and what's the one that's on the opposite side there? It's this decoupler. Okay, so now what we have are these 2 boosters will go at the beginning, okay? And then when they're run dry, we will stage them, and both of these 2 boosters will come off. But because we're doing this symmetrically, the 2 opposite ones are coming off together, the thrust is still going to remain centered on our center of mass, and this thing will still want to fly straight. So that kind of symmetry of staging is very, very important. You want to always maintain that as best you can. Again, notice how that little trick of 2 boosters, stage, and then 4 boosters has brought up my delta V even further. Well, why stop there? Let's keep pairing these up. Let's go check through all this and see if it's making sense. So first, these 2 boosters are going. Then the decoupler, is that the right decouplers? Yes, it is. And then these 2 boosters turn on. Again, notice how they're opposites to each other. Then at the next stage, we decouple those two boosters once they run dry, and then these two boosters come on, right? So we're going to go 2s, 2s, and 2s. Everything seems to be working really, really, really well. And notice how much we have brought up our delta V. This is fantastic. So in fact, we don't need all of these boosters now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take off these two boosters and go for some smaller boosters. All right. And what I'm going to do is actually, because these are the smallest ones with the least amount of thrust, it doesn't make sense to have them going at the beginning. We're going to have them going up towards the end here. So right here, and then of course we have to adjust which decouplers goes. And notice our delta V, 3,749 meters per second. This is going to fly just fine. Well, not quite. Spent a lot of time talking about delta V. Let's talk about thrust to weight ratio. And if I go down here towards the bottom and take a look at our thrust to weight ratio, you might, 1.26, that's fine. That's in a vacuum. And these two engines are going to be being fired off at the launch pad. So let's look at what their thrust to weight ratio is at sea level. And now it's 1.05. That barely will get this thing off the ground. That's not good enough, right? We want it, I like this to get in and around 1.33, in and around that kind of a range. So I can't turn up the thrust on them, so what I need, again, I need more boosters right at the beginning. That's easy enough. We're going to drag these two boosters into the mix. So now we have all 4 of the BACCs going off right at the very beginning. That gets me a thrust to weight ratio of 2.09. That's more than enough, but it's easy for us to tweak those engines down. Then we're going to stage these boosters, and we're going to have all 4 of these go off at the same time. And then our 2 small boosters come on, put it back on vacuum. We took a slight hit on delta V, but that's okay. Everything's still good by having all 4 of these going at the same, but it's still over 3,600 meters per second, so it should be fine. So now we're getting very, very close to something that is our kind of a final design. So what other things do we want to do? Well, let's adjust the positions of our rockets. So what I'm going to do is move all of these rockets down. So I'm going to take this one off, okay? And I'm also going to take the one that's opposite to it off, and we're going to throw it away. And what I would like to do, I wish there was a button to put the symmetry back on, but there is no such button. So what we're going to do is put it on two-way symmetry, put this one back in, and we're going to slide it downwards. And I like to get this cone to be below this cone. So I'm going to go next, I'm going to take this and I'm going to just use my translation tool. We're going to put this on, take the snap off, and we're just going to drag this down just a little bit. Notice how the one opposite to it is going with it. That looks pretty good. Remember that trick of dragging the boosters down so that the force of the decoupler is on the upper part of the booster, which will help it to peel away. And of course we'll just do the same with all the other ones. Alright, that is looking like a thing. Time to look at some new parts that are going to help us with this rocket. You may have noticed some of my previous rockets on launch, these boosters can get a little bit wobbly, and as your rockets get bigger, that wobble can actually very much affect your performance. We have a part to help us with that. If we go over to structural, we have a part here called the EAS-4 strut connector. So this is a bit of a different kind of part than we had before. You can see it's very, very small. I'm going to go to one of my nose cones here. I'm going to put the part on here. I'm going to again toggle the snap on. We're going to make sure we're on two-way symmetry, and then I'm going to click. And then what I have here is a strut that connects one end of the strut. Now I can connect the other end of the strut to my rocket like that. And notice it did that on the other side. And what this helps do is kind of stiffens this up. This booster now has two connection points to the rocket, one at the decoupler and one up here at this strut, and that's going to keep this nice and stiff, and we like that. We like stiffness in our rockets, not wobbliness. Okay, now you might be looking at, wait a second, when this decoupler goes, isn't this strut going to be a problem? And the answer is no, because the game will automatically remove this strut when this decoupler is staged, so we don't have to worry about the strut going away. So let's put struts on our other boosters. So again, I'm going to put this here. By the way, this part does have some weight, a little bit of weight to it, so that's why I like to put the base of the strut, when this thing separates, the base of the strut's still going to be attached to the rocket. So I like the base to be connected to the part that's being discarded. So that's why I click on the nose cone first and connect it to the rocket. It will work the other way around, but this way you don't end up with these ugly little strut bases junking up your rocket and also adding a little bit of weight. And then finally we're going to put a couple down here at the bottom to stiffen up those guys. Alright, that is looking absolutely awesome. Up next we're going to put on some more tail fins, and I got another new part. This is the AV-R8 winglet. And what makes this different from the fins I've looked at so far is this one has a control surface. It will actually adjust itself like the flap on a plane as you steer, right? So it will use aerodynamics to help you steer your vessel. That is going to be really, really useful for us, especially in the lower part of the atmosphere. As you get into the very top of the atmosphere, and certainly when you're in a vacuum, those aerodynamic surfaces become useless. But at the start of this flight, they're going to be fantastic. So I'm going to grab that. I'm going to make sure my two-way symmetry is still on, and we're going to place this right about there. Okay, so notice I got one here and one on the other side, and then we're going to get another one, and we're going to place them. And notice how you can use the textures in your booster to help you sort of get everything nice and symmetric. So I'm going to place you, I think the top of it is right at that yellow line. That looks pretty much in the right spot. This is looking rather very groovy. I got one last final new part that I want to show you, and then we're going to adjust our thrusts, and then this guy is going to be done. Again, this is under structural. We have this part here called the TT18-A Launch Stability Enhancer. Let's stick on a pair of these. Let's put these, yeah, we'll put them right here. Now, did the other one go where I wanted it to go? Yes, it did. They're exactly opposite to each other. So these are called launch clamps. They are there to hold your vessel steady until you're ready to go. Some people like, let me copy this, to put them up really high like this kind of a thing, which you are free to do, especially having it line up with the hatch. That's an aesthetic thing, so it kind of looks like a launch tower for your astronaut to climb and go back in. That's perfectly cool if that is what you want to do, but honestly, their purpose is really to be down here, to hold the rocket steady before it is ready to go. And real rockets do have launch clamps. You don't really notice them, but they're down there at the bottom holding that rocket down, holding that rocket steady, and they release once the engines are ready to go. Now, as far as the staging goes, let's take a look at our staging. Let's close a lot of this stuff. This one doesn't need to be here. There we go. Right now, the staging has these going off first. So in other words, if I launched this thing and staged it, these would release and the rocket would fall down to the launch pad. Not a good look, right? So what we want to do, well, there's two things you want to do. You could, this is the way real rockets do, is you actually, the engines go first and they fire for a few seconds because it takes in the real world some time for the engines to get up to full thrust. So they would run for a few seconds and then the launch clamp let the rocket go once these are up to full thrust. In KSP, these get the full thrust incredibly quickly. So in fact, there's nothing wrong with putting all this stuff on the same stage. It works just fine. I kind of like to do that because I find it simpler. But if you want to be a little bit more authentic and start your engines and then stage, that's perfectly cool. And we'll get into adjusting all of these thrust to weight ratios. I've talked about this before, so remember how it works. You want to start with a thrust to weight ratio in the 1.3 to about 1.35 range at sea level, and then through your stages you want a steadily increasing thrust to weight ratio till you get to about the low 2G range, and that's in a vacuum for your upper stage. And while I'm going and playing with all of this, why don't we talk about what we saw in this episode? Well, we talked a little bit about the remove symmetry feature. That's a very useful feature that's in the advanced tweakables option, and we'll be talking about other advanced tweakables in future episodes. We then spent quite a bit of time talking about the effect of how you stage to the delta V of your rocket. How you stage and when you stage is important and does affect the performance of your rocket. And just as importantly, it is important to stage symmetrically so that you will balance the thrust with the center of mass. Speaking of which, we also took a look at the center of mass and center of thrust overlays and talked about the importance that that center of thrust, or that vector of thrust, needs to always be going through your center of mass. And then finally, we did talk about some new parts. We talked about struts to stiffen our rocket. We talked about aerodynamic control surfaces to help steer our rocket in the lower part of the atmosphere. And finally, we talked about launch clamps, which not only makes our rocket look way more professional, but also does help with the stability of the launch. And now what we have is a rocket that should be able to get ourselves into low Kerbin orbit, and we should have a spacecraft that should be able to get itself to the moon, do an orbit, and then get itself back. And how we're going to accomplish that, well, that's going to be the topic for the next video. In the meantime, I thank you for watching, and I hope to see you then.